'Tis I, your old pal King Chuck. I hope you're having a happy Friday. It's a little cool outside. I'm actually taking the day off work because it's the calm before the storm. They said, take the day off. So here I am at the park. Got the park almost to myself. I do see a van across the parking lot with tanks on it. I don't know what the tanks were for, but so first things first, Tyrone update. So I had a good conversation yesterday with somebody very close to the situation. It turns out the reason why 1680 was off the air for months and months, like almost 95%, I'll say about 95% for the last 5 years, since Bob Goodrich went bankrupt and pretty much gave the station over to Tyrone Bynum. So 1680 was off the air all this time. So it turns out that Tyrone was not making payment, was not paying the bar bill on 1680. And the story was, he probably figured that 99% of the listeners that he had were listening to 102.5 anyway, so in 1680 was a big waste of electricity. So he probably decided, we're not going to, it's like from a financial standpoint, it makes sense. But from an FCC standpoint, well, he was breaking the law. And 102.5, so a translator station has to simulcast a full power AM station, a full power FM station, or an FM station side channel, HD side channel. So, and Tyrone wasn't doing that by law. And I guess reality finally caught up with him. He realized that the advertising dollars that he was getting from, rundown party stores and wig shops and whatever were his clients, were not paying the bills. So, end of story. He had to he ended up bankrupting 102.5, The Ride, in WPRR. So, now the question is, what is the station's future standing like? And, Darren Gibson did say that he is trying to convince somebody to buy the station, have a partner or whatever, and he would run it. And I think that would be a great idea. Of course, obviously, the iHeartMedias and Cumuluses of the world, Cumulus is going through bankruptcy as it is. They're not going to spend money on it. And AM radio is such a poor investment anyway. So, anyway, as it is, what I will say is Tyrone is, this is a guy who who ran 640 AM into the ground. They moved to Chicago as a result, and now 1680's future is up in the air. They're off the air because Tyrone grossly mismanaged that station. And, all I can say about Tyrone is I hope he's learning his lessons. And that lesson is that he's not helping the Grand Rapids community. The only person on this earth he really cares about is Tyrone. And Tyrone, the only nice thing I can say about him is that he's a piece of shit, especially after what he did to Darren Gibson 10 years ago. And the fact that, people like him just simply create a divide in the Democratic Party. That's part of the reason why, you see all these ads on TV for Mayor Duggan, who is running for governor, but not as a Democrat, but as an independent. Because, there is a divide in the Democratic Party. You got people who are like, well, we need to have universal health care. We need to create, shorten the gap between the wealthy and the working poor. We need to, basically lift the working poor back upward to being, financially stable again. Because look at gas prices, $4.74 a gallon. Look at, jobs. I mean, they did say this morning that there are more jobs being added, which is nice. But the question is, how much do they pay? And is a job worth having? I mean, you really can't trust Trump and his loons, if you know what I mean. So, anyway, Tyrone, I hope, is learning his lesson fair and square. I hope somebody will turn 1680 back to its former glory again, as long as, the left in Grand Rapids and the pro-democracy people who want democracy, will have their own station. And, I mean, it's nice that we have the internet. We have shows like Midas Touch and others. And we, a lot of these syndicated talk shows like Tom Hartman, they can be heard online. But unfortunately, it's nice to have a local voice too. And, it is sad that this is what happens when, it's like somebody even posted on Facebook the other day that part of the reason why radio listening is way down over the last 20, 30 years or so is because it's not what it used to be. It's not as edgy. It's not as fun. And I know. Come. Talking to my dog here. Yeah. So anyway, let's go from somebody who couldn't broadcast the hole in his ass to somebody who actually knew what he was doing. And we're going to give Ted Turner the hero of the day. As we all know by now, Ted Turner passed away on Wednesday. And Ted was 87 years old. He several years ago announced he had Lewy body dementia, which is a slow-moving type of dementia. I mean, he had it for 8 years, and Ted's story was that so the story with Ted Turner was that he didn't have the happiest life growing up. His father put him in a boarding school. His father lambasted him because he was in his bedroom reading all the time while kids outside were in the sunshine playing baseball. Of course, Ted was the owner of the Atlanta Braves baseball team. When he bought the team, they were dead last in baseball, and by the time, by 1995, they were America's team. They were the top team in baseball, won the World Series. So what happened was Ted's father was really tough on him. And then when Ted was 24 years old, his father committed suicide in 1963 or so. So what happened was when Ted's father died, he admitted that everything that his father taught him growing up just went out the window. And Ted was now his own man and was left to make his own decisions. And one decision that, of course, he took over the family company, an advertising firm. They had a ton of billboards in the South, and Ted decided that he would grow the business into broadcasting by purchasing a failing TV station in Atlanta. That station became WTCG, Channel 17. He also started a station in Charlotte, North Carolina, WRET, for Robert Edward Turner. And Channel 36 would eventually become the NBC affiliate in Charlotte. And the long story short was that Ted Turner was a builder. He built all these TV stations, he bought TV stations, and he knew that, sometimes being an independent station had its advantages, and that's exactly what he did. So he built. So what happened was, in its infancy when Ted owned it, WTBS was just another throwaway UHF station with few viewers. And what he did was he realized the power of cable TV. Cable TV was in its infancy in the 70s. Very few people had it. The few people that had cable TV only used it because it helped improve reception of TV stations that had weak signals. And but Ted realized that maybe if these cable companies could have a satellite link up to WTBS and other of these super stations like WGN in Chicago and KTLA Los Angeles, WR New York, Ted would be a powerhouse. And he did. He became one. Ted took another deep move. So this is what he did. He started this little cable network in 1980 called CNN. And some people thought that he was being a douchebag for doing this. Because, back in the olden days, the only time of the day TV news was to be shown was at 6:30, 5:30 Central. But guess what? Ted was one of the many who didn't get off work till 7 o'clock. And by the time he got home, Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor and all these people, called it a day. So anyway, that's exactly what he did. He ended up going to... But yeah, some people were like, CNN was kind of a dumb idea. An all-cable channel showing news. But you know what? It worked. And within 5 years, it was profitable. They got a lot of attention for their coverage of the Iraq War. Larry King Live became a top-rated TV show, and people took CNN for granted. And from there on, he purchased the MGM Film Library. He now owned The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind and Tom and Jerry. He started another cable network called TNT. He purchased WCW Wrestling, and he kicked Vince McMahon to the curb for many years. WWE was at a very low point because of Ted Turner. Vince and Ted hated each other, obviously. He started Cartoon Network because now he owned Hanna-Barbera. And, he had all these shows, and that included shows that weren't on TV for decades. Very short-lived cartoon shows that ended up with a new audience, like Space Ghost and what's another show I'm thinking about here? C-Lab. Oh my God. But then he also started Turner Classic Movies. And the reason why he fired up TCM was because he loved old movies and was upset about how the studios in Hollywood treated their classics. Now, Ted himself got some criticism for colorizing old movies. He felt that old movies deserved a new audience if they were colorized. And that was one of his many, he did have many failures, unfortunately. Another failure that Ted had was the cable music channel. That's right, he actually started an MTV clone in 1984, and it was off the air within a year. But nonetheless, Ted was disappointed that the studios in Hollywood were not keeping up with their classics, and Ted vowed to keep, MGM had one of the most preserved film libraries in Hollywood, and he wanted to tell the other studios, I take good care of my movies, how about you? And that's why NTCM proved how important film preservation was. So that way people of all generations can enjoy what people enjoyed, over a century. Films that are even a century old. But anyway, here's what happened with Ted. Ted decided to sell the ranch. Sold his entire company, $7 billion in 1996. He sold it all. Atlanta Braves, all of his networks, the MGM films, sold them all to Time Warner for $7 billion, and he became a board member of Time Warner, which unfortunately merged with AOL, and the tech bubble bursted, and AOL, it turned out to be a sucker move, and Ted was out of the company. And it was believed that for Ted, it was all for naught, because he actually lost about $8 billion in the whole spiel of things. Not only that, Time Warner grossly mismanaged WCW. In part because, the WWE became more extreme, more violent, more sexy. Vince McMahon knew that if it bleeds, it leads, basically. So that's exactly what happened. The Attitude Era ruined WCW, and Time Warner grossly mismanaged the company as a result, and which is why WCW ended up in the hands of, surprise, surprise, the WWE. And for many years, they had a virtual monopoly in the wrestling business. So anyway, let's get back to the rest of the story. So Ted Turner realized, Ted Turner, a lot of people did compare Ted somewhat to Trump. He had inherited wealth. He loved beautiful women. He was married to Jane Fonda. And some people even criticized him for being quite an asshole. But you know what? Ted had something Trump did not have. A conscience. You see, when Ted was a little boy reading all those books that his father didn't want him to read, one of the things that he read was that the American buffalo, was near extinction. It was an endangered species. And Ted, from reading all those books, knew the importance of preserving our, not just old movies, but the whole fucking environment. He bought up a bunch of, back in the early 90s, he created a cartoon show that I loved as a little boy called Captain Planet and the Planeteers. The show taught me and others about the importance of recycling, the importance of not wasting gasoline, the importance of, basically just taking care of our planet, taking care of its people. And that's what Ted wanted. He wanted America and the whole world to live as one and to be a world of people that take care of one another. And that's exactly what Ted did. He bought up all this land in Montana and he raised buffalo herd on there. And a lot of people said that he helped to bring back the buffalo. And another way he did that was he actually created a restaurant that served up buffalo meat. And, Ted's Grill even had a strict edict: no plastic straws, no plastic bags, none of that. It was all paper or reusable materials in there. And, and that's how he lived the rest of his life. He lived a very peaceful rest of his life. He still made appearances here and there. I think his last interview on TV might have been like 2019. That's what I'm guessing. And I know he had one more interview with Turner Classic Movies. TCM actually paid tribute to him the other day. They have been paying tribute to him. And because he is the TNT CM. And, it breaks my heart that I look at his legacy. And now Warner Brothers is in danger of being sold to Paramount and Skydance. And they're probably going to look at him and say, his legacy, and cry, look. We don't need this anymore. Who's going to watch this crap? They're probably, and of course already they're eyeing TCM. Not TCM, but CNN, excuse me. The ultra right wing, the Trump regime, they want CNN to go bye-bye. They want CNN to go away because they think they're too liberal. Or at least become a mouthpiece for the Trump regime, because, we all know Barry Weiss, she already is fucking up CBS. And ever since Tony DeCopo took over the CBS Evening News, their ratings have really taken a gigantic nosedive. What's funny is, they demoted Norah O'Donnell many years ago. And, of course, Norah had this interview with Trump, and it was kind of a kiss-ass piece, unfortunately. And even her ratings sucked. And now CBS is even worse. It's like, and now they're getting rid of the radio news division in a couple of weeks. Now I'm asking what's some of their stations going to do. So all I can say is that things are going to get pretty interesting. Anyway, the other night on AEW Wrestling, they paid tribute to Ted. Of course, AEW is airing on TBS and TNT. They did a 10-bell salute to him. And Tony Schiavone and Sting, two of WCW's GOATs, they were out there to pay tribute to him. And, it was a fitting tribute to a man, even though he was beyond wealthy. He actually had a conscience. He didn't care about his wealth. Money was just a material issue to him. He just wanted America to be better off. So anyway, anyway, Ted Turner, rest well, buddy. Thank you for all the years of good entertainment you've given us. And my thoughts are definitely with your family, your friends, your colleagues. Knowing that, and I know that you know, that you probably did way more good in this country, this world, than bad. So thank you, Ted. And speaking of, now I didn't know what Ted thought of Donald Trump. Gas prices are still sky high, $4.74 a gallon here in Grand Rapids. My gas tank is actually pretty low, unfortunately. So I am going to try my best not to drive all over the place. Do my best to do so, especially with the lower pay that I'm getting from work because of the lack of work we're having right now. Well, that's going to change in a few weeks probably. So here's what's going on with Trump. You know, one thing that sticks up in my mind, is all the talks about mergers and acquisitions. Mergers don't help people, folks. I told you the story about my uncle. He worked for Time Warner. And when AOL merged with Time Warner, he was out of a job. And he worked for that company for many, many years. He provided for his wife and 3 kids. They got to meet some of the most biggest and best stars in entertainment. I mean, I was always jealous because I was up north in northern Michigan where everything is all Republican and country music and, all the so-called friends that I had, only liked me because of money and I had a car and everything. That was it. But I want to talk about, if you will, I want to talk about mergers and acquisitions for a few minutes. Donald Trump last weekend, Spirit Airlines went out of business. And Donald Trump pissed and moaned that if the company merged with JetBlue, the JetBlue and Spirit merger would have helped the company. And I say, nope, that's not how life works. Because both companies are saddled with debt. Billions of debt. And now you're going to have 2 companies with more debt. Not only a lot more debt, but you're also going to be having people lose their jobs. Because that's what mergers do. That's what happens in a merger. People will lose their jobs. And that's exactly what happened to my uncle. He lost his job because of this merger. But here's what happened. But here's what really happened with Spirit Airlines. Spirit was hoping that Donald Trump would lower the gas prices because, let's face it, Spirit was paying the same jet fuel price as all the bigger, more expensive airlines like United, Delta, and American. And let's face the facts. It's like there's really not much more. I mean, Spirit was a no-frills airline. There wasn't much more they can cut. So that's exactly the point. Spirit Airlines, and not only that, with Trump blaming Biden for this merger from not happening. Well, the truth was, it was because of a judge who happened to be a Reagan appointee. It was not because of Biden at all. And if at all, let's face the facts. Trump loves mergers. Trump loves it when 2 companies merge, so that way they can bring out any employee they want, including people who were actually productive. And Trump was saying that, we were saving money with Doge, we were saving money with tariffs, and that people would get a check in the mail. I'm still waiting for mine, folks. And so is my father. You know, my father, he still loves Trump. He's one of the 33% of all Americans who loves Trump. Still. But, you know, we're smarter than him, folks. Donald Trump is fucking up America with his lies, his rhetoric, his bigotry. And, you know, Biden, and I know people hated Biden too because he was old. But the economy prospered under Biden. And we did better under him. This country grew because of Biden. And it's a shame that that Joe, didn't want to run for a second term. And his the disastrous speech that he had at the debate with Trump proved it. But Trump was even worse. And you look at Trump now, and he is acting beyond senile. Sleeping at, he called him Sleepy Joe. And Sleepy, and Joe. Yeah, and then you look at Trump, he's the one falling asleep at meetings and when there's important things going on. He's got those sores on his arms, and he's not, and they all simply lie and say, well, these sores on his arms, well, they're just from shaking hands. Yeah, that's a lie. But, let me tell you about one merger that was prevented during the Biden administration that I am very proud never happened. And that was the merger between Kroger and Albertsons, two of the largest supermarket chains in this country, were about to merge. And, the sad truth, folks, is that, if the merger happened, then they were going to go through their list of stores that probably made less money than this store and that store and shut them all down. And a lot of grocery workers would be out of business. And, I can tell you, folks, I love looking at old newspapers from like 50, 60 years ago. The grocery business has without a doubt changed a lot. And, once upon a time, grocery stores here in Michigan had several different suppliers to choose from. You had Spartan, you had IGA, you had Viking, I almost said SureFresh. SureFresh was the private label for both Spartan and Viking. Scotland was another one. They were based out of Illinois. And, well, the story was Viking and Scotland were bought out in the 80s by a firm called Roundy's, based out of Wisconsin. And Roundy's had their own private label, and they decided to stop distributing to grocery stores in the 2000s. And I believe, I don't know if they sold it or just transferred the store list that they had to another supplier, and that supplier was Nash Finch out of Bridgeport, I believe. And believe it or not, we all knew what happened here in Michigan. Nash Finch and Spartan stores merged. And then and of course, on top of that, IGA, their big supplier here in Michigan was a company called Great North Foods. They were based out of Alpena. And Great North ended up closing. And what happened was Great North, they transferred their list to a firm out of Menominee up in the UP called Great Lakes Foods. And guess who bought them out? Spartan Nash. So now, most grocery stores here in the great state of Michigan have not one, but just two suppliers to choose from. You can choose from Spartan Nash, which, by the way, was purchased by a firm called C&S Wholesale last year. C&S has their own house brand called the Best Yet, and they also own Piggly Wiggly. So, and of course, what happened was when Spartan and Nash Finch merged, Spartan's brand was Spartan, and Nash Finch had Our Family, and they said, well, we're going to be separate from each other for a while. But at the end of the day, guess what happened? The Spartan brand was killed off for the Our Family brand. So now there's a ton of grocery stores here in Michigan that are supplied by Spartan Nash. And these stores are range from giant corporate owned stores like Family Fare and D&W to small little stores in the middle of nowhere. So here's the story. Let me give you a little story about one store. Let me give you a little brief history about one such store. I grew up in Antrim County, Michigan, and there was a little grocery store in Ellsworth called Shook's Market. Shook's, I believe, started up in 1930, and the guy who started it was Tony Shook's, I should say. His last name was spelled Shooks, but his name was anglicized from Sjoeks. So, Shook's Market was a small little minnow in a giant pond of grocers. And, East Jordan was just a few miles away from Ellsworth. East Jordan had an E&P store and other stores that had where people could buy for way less money. And, now that people own cars, people could drive to East Jordan and, buy their groceries and then come home to Ellsworth and not spend a dime in town. So this is what Tony did with a bunch of other store owners. In the early 1930s, during the Great Depression, they met up at a hotel in Cadillac, and they formed a grocers cooperative called Associated Grocers. And what happened was they would buy from a warehouse in Grand Rapids, the Grand Rapids Wholesale Grocery Company, and they would keep the prices low for the consumer. And it really helped Shook's, because by the early 1940s, the store became a self-service store, as opposed to you walk in with a list and they would have to get everything from behind the counter, and it was sometimes it was the wrong item. Yeah. So, but Associated Grocers became so popular here in West Michigan. By the late 1940s, there were 450 stores that were supplied by them. But because there were other stores with that very same name of Associated Grocers, they decided in 1952 to change their name to Spartan Stores. And Spartan, and of course, they even had an old jingle. It's a Spartan store if there's a Spartan on the door. So, Spartan stores now supplied a lot of really tiny family-owned stores, a little general store in the middle of nowhere, to modern, clean stores. Like in where I grew up in Traverse City, Olson's built a store on Garfield Avenue that was, for its time, very modern for its time. And of course, Prevost became popular. Tom's started building some good sized stores. So what happened, and of course, even here in Grand Rapids, there were a couple of chains that came out of nowhere that grew from leaps and bounds. But there was some greed in the system. because there were some of these stores had multiple locations, and they wanted to compete with the bigger stores still. Like, Meijer was really growing in the 60s with the Thrifty Acres concept, and some of the stores decided, they needed to have both grocery and retail in the same building. So this is what happened. Spartan decided to become competitive in the 70s, from graduating from being a co-op to becoming a publicly traded company. So the investors were basically looking at some of the local family-owned stores, the little tiny stores in Timbuktu, and they were like, so they basically wanted to squeeze them out. And how did they do that? Well, they basically started telling stores that if your store was lower than, smaller than 15,000 square feet and did not make $75,000 a year, then it cannot be a Spartan store. You had to find a different supplier. So what happened was some of these stores were indeed squeezed out of the Spartan system. And I actually worked at one such store in Torch River Bridge. The Torch River Bridge in northern Michigan. Of course, Kid Rock wrote that song all summer long, allegedly about Torch River. So the story was, I worked at the Village Market Party Store at the Torch River Bridge, mid-90s. And the guy who owned it owned the Village Market in Elk Rapids, which was a Spartan store. I looked around the Village Market Party Store and I noticed there wasn't any Spartan items on the shelf. And I asked, how come? And my boss told me, Spartan would not allow us to become a Spartan store because we're too small. Gotta have at least 15,000 square feet. This store was way smaller. The store, believe it or not, was a Spartan store back in the day. It was originally called Dan Way's Market. Dan Way owned the store, and then he died in a house fire in 1966. And I guess the store was sold. It remained a Spartan store for a while, but then somebody bought it and decided to turn it into a party store. But when Rick Young bought it in 1981, I believe, he was able to bring back some groceries and produce, some meats and produce that were bummed out from the Elk Rapids store, so people wouldn't have to drive all the way to Elk Rapids. Of course, but then again, there was another supermarket down the street. He eventually bought that one. That was an old Viking food store over in Rapid City. But anyway, he ended up selling the party store at the Torch River Bridge. He sold it to another owner, and his family still owns both the Rapid City and Elk Rapids stores. Of course, Rick died last year. Now his son, Kevin, owns it. And, in Village Market, the Village Markets are doing pretty good. They just renovated and expanded their beer cave in Elk Rapids. I want to see that, and maybe in a few weeks I'll be able to go up north. Who knows? So this is what happened to Shook's Market. So Shook's Market was the penultimate grocery store in Ellsworth for decades. In 1967, they moved to a new location in downtown Ellsworth that used to be an IGA. The original store was a rickety old building that was later demolished. So Shook's Market operated from this location throughout the rest of its life. We should also point out that once upon a time, Ellsworth had another Spartan store in town called Vander Arks that was in business in the early 20th century. And they were out of business by early 60s or so. I believe the building was demolished. It was over by where the Golden Nugget bar is now. But yeah, Vander Ark's, I guess, also was a bit of a general store. It had like clothes and dry goods and stuff like that. So what happened was Shook's was now the only grocery store in town. And, you know, they were not a convenience store. They were only open Monday through Saturday, like 9 to 6 every day. So what happened to Shook's? So this is what happened. Just down the street from Shook's, there was the town convenience store called Artemis. It was the town gas station and convenience store. And Artemis, so the story with Artemis was that it was sold to a man named Ron Hext in 1983. He renamed it Ron's General Store. And they were open on Sundays, too, and longer hours for everybody in town that, you know, didn't like the hours that Shook's had. So what happened was Hext knew about the shortcomings that Shook's had. So in 1986, he expanded the store. He got rid of gas because he figured, you know, the town had another gas station, which was the local farmers co-op across the street. So this is what he did. He got rid of the gas pumps. He expanded the building to 6,000 square feet, which is pretty big for a town of just 400 souls. And he got himself an affiliation agreement with Viking Foods. So now it was Ellsworth Viking Foods. And, you know, it had a little coffee bar. They had a little restaurant inside. You know, you could get a slice of pizza. And I believe they also had video rentals too. I mean, it was the 80s. But it was still a lot smaller than the stores in East Jordan. East Jordan had a Glenn's Market that was a pretty good sized store. That was of course, Glenn's, the Spartan Stores was a very dominant supermarket chain in northern Michigan throughout the late 20th century. So what happened was, the battle between Shook's and Ellsworth Viking Foods proved to be a very fatal one. So by the early 1990s, Ron Hext made the decision to downsize the store again back to being a party store. He knew that people were not coming to his store to do their full week shopping. They were just going there to get pizza. And, he figured, he would still run it like a convenience store, but, they would also still sell meats and some produce. They would no longer have supermarket items like, of course, Viking Foods. They were bought out in 89. I guess they went with a convenience store supplier or something like that. So this is what happened. Not long after the downsizing, and of course he changed the name to Ellsworth Village Market because Viking Foods went out, like I said, they were bought out by Roundy's. So what happened was Ellsworth Village Market, which was a dumb name to begin with because there was already a village market in Elk Rapids, as I mentioned earlier, not too horribly far from Elk Rapids, in Rapid City. So what happened was Ron eventually sold the store to somebody else. And right around the same time, Spartan Stores and Shook's were no longer seen eye to eye. And Shook's was counting on, their legacy, being a legacy member of Spartan, to remain with the chain. Well, that wasn't enough. Allegedly, Spartan came to the Shook's family and said, "We're spending more money sending our trucks to you guys than what you make in a week. It ain't working anymore." So I guess Mr. Shook's went to Spartan and said, "We give up. or we're going to sell the store. And they sold it to the owners of Ellsworth Village Market, the new owner. And they turned it into a sporting goods store called the Sports Fisherman. And this, because Ellsworth had a lot of hunters and fishers and outdoorsy people, they even had a state-of-the-art archery station in there where people could go out and, practice their shooting and bow hunting skills. But here's what happened. Word had it that the owner tried to set the Village Market building on fire because there was some exterior damage to the store because something was caught on fire, and thankfully the fire was extinguished. But what's this asshole doing? Anyway, so he set the bill. So my apologies. We got a total asshole out here, unfortunately. Let's see if we can get back into my car. Anyway, so what happened was, So anyway, Shooks. So anyway, what they did for a while at the Village Market was they put some of the essential items into the village, into the store, the hunting and fishing store. And this is what happened. He ended up, so they reopened shortly thereafter, but then they closed again because they ended up bankrupt. They lost everything. So now, for the first time ever, Ellsworth did not have a grocery store. And what made the sad story unique was that when the store closed, you see, usually when a grocery store in a small town closes, they have the gas stations and the party store to, help them out. Ellsworth now had no store because the only gas station in town was the Farmers Co-op. The town didn't even have a store to buy a gallon of milk. You actually had to go all the way to East Jordan or Central Lake. And I think even Atwood still had a little gas station at the time. So to telescope the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey once said, what happened with Ellsworth was that many people over the years bought the Village Market building and turned it into another, one failed grocery store after another. And it was just that people in the community were very upset about how it was run and how people, misconceived these types of stores as being overpriced and greedy owners. And I mean, it was, the sad truth was, some of these owners were actually making less money than you and me, because the markup on grocery items has always been very low, especially in a situation where you don't have a lot of, especially in a situation where you do have competition, and the competition will try to undercut you on everything. So, but anyway, here's what happened. A few years ago, the store had its last owner. As a matter of fact, the folks who owned Ellsworth Village Market and the Sports Fisherman, they actually bought the Village Market back again, but couldn't make a go of it. So this is what happened. They ended up, so anyway, they sold it to one more owner. They couldn't make a go of it. And guess what happened? It became a storage facility. And that's what it is now. It's a sport, it probably makes far more money as a storage facility than it did it as a grocery store. And then what happened was after that, so this is what happens. As for Shook's Market, well, this is what happened. It was a small grocery store for a while when the Village Market was closed, and then they moved into the Village Market. It was owned by a guy named Big George. And I remembered Big George. He was a very morbidly obese guy. He was on oxygen, and eventually he died. And long story short, with the Shook's Market building, which also was the old IGA in Ellsworth, it was, they sold everything from antiques to secondhand items over the years. And at the end of the day, the building was an eyesore. It was structurally unsafe. So they ended up selling the store. So anyway, what happened was, I guess the owners of the bar next door, the Golden Nugget, bought it out, tore it down, and now it's outdoor seating. So now Ellsworth doesn't have a grocery store. So this is exactly why they were welcome to to Dollar General coming to the community. So now people in Ellsworth at least have a place to buy a gallon of milk or a liter of pop or bread or cereal or whatever. But it's not necessarily a good place to do your full grocery shopping. But then again, that's the sad reality of a lot of these communities that are very small. I actually at work with a guy whose family, both sides of his family own grocery stores, 2 Spartan stores in the community. And he helped to manage one of them with his late father. And he told me that grocery stores these days nobody wants to own a grocery store because they're not profitable unless you have a ton of them. And it's true. And because the markup, you got to keep your markup pretty low to stay competitive. A couple of years ago, the New York Times published a piece about this grocery store in a small town also in northern Michigan called Honor. It's owned by the Schneider family. It's, Honor Family Market. And they have been trying to sell for years and nobody wants it. And even worse is the fact that all the members of the Schneider family are in their 60s and 70s. And the kids don't want it either. And I guess one of them died. And I guess they were thinking, maybe somebody from New York will want to move it to northern Michigan and start a grocery store. Last I heard, it's still Honor Family Market, and it's still owned by the Schneiders. And, it's true. The grocery business is getting tougher and tougher. And in my honest opinion, having, 2 chains like Albertsons and in Kroger merge would only make things worse. Because if there's somebody out there who doesn't like small town people, it's Trump. He shut down the hospitals. There's now multiple communities in the United States that don't even have a pharmacy because pharmacies are being cut to the brim too. I mean, look at what happened with Rite Aid. Hell, there was even a CVS down the street from where I live, and they closed. It's now a plasma place. Yeah. I once donated plasma. Never again. But you see, folks, that's the way it is with Trump. People like Donald Trump. He wants to create a world where the wealthy have it all, but the small guy, they got to work even harder for nothing. And even worse, for these small town people, they now have to drive much further just for simple grocery items. And to me, that's kind of wrong. It makes me proud that I live in a town like, right here in Grand Rapids where, you got it's like I got Aldi, you got Meijer, you got Family Fare, you got, there's a Save-A-Lot not far from where I live. There used to be a ton of small Spartan stores, and they all closed, but it's because of competition. The thing is that, yeah, there is that part of me that says, I want to support the small guy. I want to help keep them in business. But it's not always easy when, but yeah, it's going to get worse and worse with fewer suppliers. And when we got fewer suppliers, you get higher prices. And, not only that, it's like, I don't know, honestly, if Spartan's old rules still apply or not. And the reason why I'm saying this is because, there's one grocery store that was a longtime member of Spartan that I know of up in northern Michigan called NJ's. NJ's Market, NJ's Grocery in Lake Leona. It was owned by the Plamondon family from 1912 up until, I want to say, about 20 years ago. And so what happened was the last Plamondon to own it sold it to an Indian family. And because it was a really tiny store, they switched suppliers for a while from Spartan to Roundy's. And eventually they were supplied by Great North Foods. Of course, Great North was the big IGA supplier, but they chose not to be an IGA. They went with the other house brand that they had called, I think it was High Top. There we go. So what happened was, and then they switched over to Great Lakes Foods out of Menominee once again. And their house brand was actually Best Choice, which is also the house brand of private label of Associated Foods Northwest. Associated Foods, that's, or Midwest, I forgot their name. But anyway, Associated Foods, they have the Best Choice and Always Save brands. And here in Grand Rapids, there is a grocery store that does supply those brands, and that's Price Cutter over at 28th and Eastern. So let me tell you what happened. So guess what happened? They ended up being, so what happened was when Great Lakes, so guess what? Great Lakes was sold to Spartan Nash. So once again, NJ's is with Spartan Nash. Isn't that something? So they were basically grandfathered back into the system again, and, they are back to being a Spartan store in one way, shape, or form. But, of course, they had a big fire last year. Thankfully, the business was saved, but, and the building was saved. But, it did enough damage that they had to basically throw away everything and kind of rebuild on the exterior front. So anyway, that's what happens when a store catches fire. They have to get rid of everything and put everything back on shelves again. But anyway, but that's kind of how the Spartan operates. And it's, as long as they make money, I guess that's how it works. So all I have to say about that is, there is that part of me that says I want to support the local guy, but you also have to take a deep look into him and her and the family, and how really nice they are, how friendly they are. I mean, I have a million different grocery stories to tell, but the important thing is that the grocery business needs to not have a billion different mergers, because small towns are getting hurt. But then again, you got to realize who lives in these small towns, and they are all conservatives. They all voted for Trump. They love the guy. They love Trump because Trump speaks their language. But then he shuts down the hospitals. He shuts down the pharmacies, the grocery stores, you name it. And guess who gets hurt at the end? Me and you. And of course, with gas prices at as high as they are, it's only going to get worse. Oh, but I don't want my kid to become a transgender. Oh, I don't want, the gays to be everywhere. I don't like woke. Oh. Yeah, I moved to Timbuktu to get away from them colored people. Oh, I don't want to be around them. I love Trump. Ay vey. But don't cry to me when your supermarket closes, or your pharmacy closes, or your hospital closes. Because guess what, folks? I never voted Republican, period, full stop. And that's what I have to say about that. All right, folks. I blabbed for well over an hour. I got to get going. I'm in a hot car with my dog now. So, good day and good luck. Have a great Mother's Day, everyone.